At the end of this video, I'll share my opinion. Let's hear Dr. Peterson.
Here's my problem. Now, I've listened to a lot of hawks on the American side talk about, well, two things. About the fact that, and this is independent of the merits of this claim, it appears likely that the Ukraine, supported by the West in the manner it has been supported, can do serious damage to Russia's conventional arms force. I think there is evidence that the Ukrainians and the West are pushing the Russians back, and God only knows how far that will go. And the hawks that I've talked to said that's a good thing. It's in our interest to ensure that Russia is no longer a conventional military threat. No, I have a certain degree of sympathy for that viewpoint. But then here's the counter problem as I see it. So I try to look forward into the future and I think, okay, what does a victory for the West look like? Forget about Ukraine. Ukraine victory is they get their territory back and there's a wall between them and the Russians, and the pesky Russians leave them alone and they go back to whatever level of appalling corruption they had managed before the war. Right. And so that's the Ukraine victory. The West, well, let's say we could do this two ways. Okay, so Putin is deposed, however that happens, and then what? And then we have a better leader in Russia? We have a more trustworthy leader? Yeah, I don't think so. The Russians haven't got a great history of that, and no matter what you think of Putin, it's definitely the case that he isn't the worst leader that emerged in Russia in the last 100 years by any measure. True. So that's a big problem. And then I think, well, instead of Putin being replaced by someone who could be better, but probably won't be, we'll have a Russia that's really fragmented and that, the country in some ways collapses. And that's a really bad idea because there's a lot of nuclear bombs there. And if you get the fragmentation of that power structure into multiple chieftains, let's say, and a few of them emerge armed with nuclear bombs, then we have a major problem on our hands. And that seems to me to be a highly likely outcome. And then if we weaken Russia severely and permanently, then we have the problem of a severely and permanently weakened Russia. And that's a big problem because they produce a lot of fertilizer and the Europeans happen to be dependent on them for a lot of their energy needs. So that doesn't look very wise. And then we have the absolute bloody catastrophic probability that if Putin starts to lose in any serious way and so starts to believe that Russian territorial integrity is threatened, however he defines that he has an immense array of unbelievably powerful next generation weapons at his disposal. And why the hell wouldn't he use them? Imagine the West wins. Okay, what does that mean? I don't see what that means. I haven't heard anyone describe to me what the goal of this war is. We're supporting the heroic Ukrainians. It's like, yeah, you're a moralizing scoundrel. That's not a plan. That's idiot hand-waving, as bad as the environmental, doomsayers. It's the same thing. Cheap moral victory. When after the Germans went into France in World War I and wreaked havoc in that idiot war, World War I, their entire industrial machine was devastated. They had a period of hyperinflation. They were subject to that extraordinarily punitive Versailles Treaty. And that could be imposed upon them because they were devastated. And hypothetically, we could do the same thing with the Russians if they're beat very badly on the conventional front and they emerge weak. And we put punitive measures in place to keep them weak. And then we might remember just exactly what happened to Germany as a consequence of the Versailles Treaty, because they didn't stay weak for long. And, maybe the Russian nuclear weapons are no better than anything else the Soviets built, but that doesn't mean a few of them won't go off. And it's really not going to take that many because after all, they are nuclear weapons. And so even one that doesn't work that well is going to be a lot more spectacular than anything that happened in 1945 in Hiroshima. We can be absolutely certain of that. So again, the mystery is, fair enough, man, we want victory. Okay, no problem. What's the victory? And who's the them? That's the other things. Well, exactly. We need to punish the Russians. It's like, well, who exactly are you talking about here? Right. Are you talking about the elites that are in control? Are you talking about the whole damn population? For how long? And as you already pointed out, to what end?
To what end?
So to what end? To what end is all this? And well, we touched on that a little bit. You can't help but, and this is where I suppose I turn into a leftist in some real sense, at least in relationship to what you might describe as a stance against gigantism. It's like, to what end? Well, how about military industrial profits that are staggering? How about that end? And if there's no other end in sight, and I'm not particularly skeptical about capitalism except in its gigantism forms, it's like, if there's no other end being outlined, well, I'm going to go with profit as the motive, because if you have a better theory, man, lay it out. But I don't see anything. And given that it was Eisenhower who knew what he was talking about, having been Supreme Commander of the Allied Forces, when he warned about the military-industrial complex being the biggest threat we faced back in about 1959, that was something to take seriously, and it's something to take seriously again. So what, do you have any sense, and have you talked to anybody who, as far as you're concerned, has some reasonable vision about what actually might be done in a sensible manner on the Russia-Ukraine front?
Well, the reasonable people who are rooted in reality and not fantasy understand that the only way to bring about an end to this war is through diplomatic means of bringing together the different stakeholders and actually coming to an understanding, whether it's through the form of a treaty or whatever that agreement may look like, where no one is going to walk away happy, but there is a reasonable approach to being able to find that agreement. You'll hear from the Biden administration anytime this is brought up, well, Zelensky and Ukraine have to be the ones to drive this. They're the ones who have to set the terms and everything else. The only way that they're able to continue doing what they're doing is through the means that the United States, largely the United States, but also some other countries in Europe, are providing them with the weapons and the money and the ability to do so. So the United States has, President Biden,
we could definitely stop lying about. We could definitely stop lying about the fact that this is Ukraine.
Yeah, exactly.
Like nobody with any sense at all believes that. I mean, we're in a proxy war for sure, and we have been from the beginning, and so we might as well be crystal clear about that.
Exactly.
So Trump popped up the other day, as he has a proclivity to do, and he said, if I was president, I'd stop this war in 24 hours. And, that's typical Trump overstatement, I would say, but it is the case that the war emerged on Biden's watch and not Trump's watch, and that's not nothing. And so, what do you make of that? What do you make of Trump? We diagnosed the Democrats a bit. Let's turn to the Republicans.
Only Trump knows what Trump would be doing in this situation. But as we're talking about a diplomatic end to this war, something that should have happened a very long time ago, something the Biden administration has been blocking, categorically blocking even efforts between Russian and Ukrainian officials on their own who are trying to come together. It's been the United States that has been blocking them, telling Ukraine, no, leave the table, don't negotiate.
How have they been blocking? What are the details?
There are multiple reports publicly of Biden administration officials telling Ukraine not to negotiate, as well as other countries who have been also sharing that they've been getting that same message, going all the way back to, I think, March. Shortly after this war kicked off, when there were.
I heard the same thing. I heard that from people I was talking to who knew what they were talking about in Israel too. That the Russians. There were avenues open quite early in the conflict where diplomatic maneuvering could have hypothetically proved useful, and that was blocked. Now, I'm not saying it would have been useful, but I couldn't understand when this all broke out why the number one priority of Western leaders, who instead gathered to, make fun of Putin's hypermasculinity, and it was a pretty sad bunch of wimps gathered around the G7 table who were managing that, I might say, instead of noting that if they had any sense at all, they'd be trying to broker something like an intelligent arrangement so that we didn't face the likely possibility of being dragged by our shirt sleeve into the maw of the military-industrial complex and end up all torn to shreds as a consequence, which I think is the most likely outcome of what's happening now. Because what I know something about World War I and World War II, and the other wars we've been in since, is that what tends to happen is you get pulled in one stupid step at a time, especially if you're also turning a blind eye to the chicanery of your wealthy friends who are profiting like mad on the war front. And so People always, I think they said, when World War I started, it was like, the troops will be home for Christmas. It's like, yeah, guess that didn't happen. And then it's many, many years later, and it's not like that didn't happen in Vietnam or Iraq or Afghanistan.
Exactly.
This will be over soon. It's like,
Yes.
yeah, I don't think so.
So I guess only brave people might dare to agree with Dr. Peterson, because in case they'll do, they'll be called Putinist freaks. I remember very well when I first heard the war started. What the hell is Putin thinking? What the hell are all the Russians thinking? A few weeks into the war, and I kept hearing about eights of billions of dollars and weapons being delivered to Ukraine. As I love to think for myself, I started to ask a pure objective question. Why? Ukraine isn't part of NATO, isn't part of European Union, so it isn't an official ally to the West. So why is everybody sending weapons to Ukraine? I agree that the West's support of Ukraine is not worth the risk of a potentially weakened Russia, because it will lead to a catastrophic outcome. I agree that if Russia were to collapse, it could create major economic problems for Europe, which relies on Russia for energy needs. I agree that there's no clear definition of how a victory would look like for the West. I agree that not all Russians deserve to be punished. I agree that this war is all about profits. Just the USA sent over $100 billion to Ukraine. Alright, but what about their own defense budget? What about the allocation of more than $1 trillion worth in military defense contracts? Something's fishy about this war, and generally the first thing you should think about when you can't tell the intentions of someone, think about the money. I just love Dr. Peterson's approach to this. Okay man, if you have another theory that could make a bit of sense, I'm all ears. Another thing I point out is to never ever trust the media companies. I know for sure that the West is financing almost all major news publications in Europe. Information is not power. The capacity to deliver information is power. So the West having such a great influence over all media companies, you kinda know what I'm getting to. We argue for free speech, but we censor everything that's coming out from Russia, and once in a while when something Russian made manages to break out the barriers and reach out to our ears, it's called Russian propaganda. Can you even comprehend the fact that a missile could hit a 1 million people protest, kill them all, and all Western Europe and European media companies could lie to you that it was Putin, when in fact it wasn't? Look, I'm neither pro-Putin nor pro-Zelensky. I'm not stupid. I have the capacity to remain objective. Truly do. But this smells more and more to me like the biggest mass manipulation we faced in human history. Speak the truth, people, always. Why the people in power don't understand we need to be mindful of the human cost of this conflict? Why do we lose sight of the fact that there are people on both sides who are suffering and dying as a result of this war? We need to find a way to resolve this conflict peacefully and avoid further escalation. We have the internet. Let's do something. If you're still here, maybe you'd like to subscribe. Here's Obi, and I'll see you in the next video.